And then we get to this unbirthday party, and it's as insane as possible. Like it is
So
just
wild,
like
man.
I honestly watching the movie overstimulated. I was like when that
Yeah.
scene, I was getting stressed out a
There's
little
so
bit.
much happening on in like every frame.
Welcome, friends, to episode 310 of the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book and then see the movie. I'm filmmaker James Bailey,
And I'm writer Luke Elliott.
and this week we discuss Walt Disney's 1951 film, Alice in Wonderland. So, Luke, I'll start by saying very merry unbirthday to you, and very merry
yeah.
unbirthday to all of our listeners, if it's not your birthday.
Except for maybe a few.
Yeah. Here we are with the animated Disney film. We've covered a few now. I think we did at least Snow White, and I think there
Yep.
may have been another Cinderella.
Cinderella, yeah.
Yeah.
Pinocchio, we also did as a bonus.
Interesting to put all of these animated films into context because, like, I don't think it's a controversial figure Walt Disney is, but
Yeah.
also he has quite a legacy for animated films, and he is sort of the father of the modern animated film. So all these animated films that we love, I think a lot of them are owed to Walt Disney. So, this will be an interesting one to discuss.
Yeah, and I think last week I said that I had seen this movie, and maybe I've seen parts of it. But watching this thing, I was like, I've never seen this movie in its entirety. This is so unlike many of the other Disney films from this era. It's fascinating, actually, how different this feels. Even as certain hallmarks are there, like the look of it is very in line. There's this like rising swell of like a chorus that like defines the sound of those early Walt Disney soundtracks to me. I don't know how to describe it, but it's very ethereal. It's like this whole choral arrangement, and it reminds me of Bambi, or reminds me of just a lot of these like really early ones, right? And we get that here. So there's a lot of familiarity there, but then also this thing totally, in fact, it leans into the dreamlike nonsense of the books. And in many ways, like, I can see why this probably wasn't on my radar as a kid, because I don't know how much I would have liked it. It would have been very strange. It's kind of a strange movie, and times it gets really strange.
So when this movie came out, it wasn't very well received. Like, it wasn't well reviewed. It didn't make a ton of money at the box office. And I think that really is from because of what you're picking up on there. Is like,
Yeah.
it's a bizarre movie because it's for the sake of being bizarre. Like, it's meant to
Yeah.
be a dream, and like leaning into that in hindsight, looking back at it, while maybe it wasn't reviewed back then very well, now people look back at it and think it's one of the best in the catalog of the Disney's catalog of animated films. And I think that does have a lot to do with the uniqueness. It feels different. It's got
Yeah.
a lot of things going for it that aren't like the typical princess story or, any of those other things that they were very well known for in that early era.
Yeah, in some ways it was groundbreaking. It was trying something different. There's a lot that I can see as to like why it's had this groundswell of popularity in the years since, but I can also kind of see the arguments at the time for why this didn't stand up to some of the other massive movies, because I thought the songs were not quite up to par with some of those iconic soundtracks from early Disney movies. Some of them were okay, but I didn't find any that were like really sticking in my head. There was no like earworms in there. Nothing that I felt like was just like iconic, right? Where I'm like, I'm going to be singing this forever now. Whereas a lot of those early Disney films always had a song or two like that. So there's things to like. There's things that I think were rightfully probably looked at with a bit of skepticism. But the main thing is that like this is such a weird movie with some really striking and I think probably quite groundbreaking for the time visuals, and daring choices made. And then if you start to look at it all as a metaphor for a drug trip, it really starts to work on a whole different level. And so much of it I could see is just like, taking some mushrooms or something and turning this on and really getting psychedelic. And I think that there was probably a lot of people who loved it for that reason. I even partook in a herbal mint while I was watching this movie. The variety that's only available in about half the states in our country right now. And I thought that would be appropriate for watching this movie. And maybe that sort of colored my reaction to it, but I thought that would probably be in line and in keeping with the spirit of this, I think.
I would reiterate only legally available in half the states. But
What are you talking about? There's no way you can get things illegally. What do
yeah.
you mean?
So anyway, what you're talking about is like such a big part of the legacy of this story at this point, right? Like this film came out in the 50s, wasn't well regarded really, and it was shown on TV a few times, but it wasn't until 1974 that it was re-released, and it had this massive swell.
Oh,
And
you know that makes sense to me is all the kids who grew up in the 50s were now like 20 somethings and just starting to get into drug culture, and they were like probably had a lot of fondness for this movie, and now all of a sudden they could look at it through a whole new light.
yeah, I mean, you got to think like some of them saw it possibly in theaters, and then like time goes by and it's kind of becomes a movie that not a lot of people are talking about. But yeah, when it was re-released, it made a ton more money than it did at the initial time, and it was like 20 years from initial release to a re-release
Wow.
in theaters, while all the other Disney films were released back in theaters over and over again. And this was kind of relegated to like a chopped up 1 hour version that they would show on TV sometimes. I was so curious and I had to start looking and digging. I read a few articles. There's one from the New Yorker and there's one from Medium that we can link to in the show notes. But basically, like, they are talking about the idea of this story and like, were there possibilities that like Walt Disney himself was into psychedelics, and like that's maybe part, because I think he's a man of vision, right? Of creativity possibly. And like, I
Hmm.
think a lot of people think of these mind altering substances as like opening up some of those creative synapse. And there's like, I guess, some good arguments as to him possibly using, and especially some of his animators and directors and things like that that were working at the time that were kind of behind closed doors, broadening their horizons and minds in those ways. And it's just interesting to then think of this as like something that they were animating and what looked visually interesting to them. And there's no question that there is some, I mean, it does kind of get subjective though, because it's like, to me, it doesn't seem like there's any way that these people weren't in some way familiar with some of the visuals and things that you might experience, because it just does feel like mushrooms. And like there were some areas where Disney actually promoted it as a film in tune with quote unquote the psychedelic times, using radio commercials featuring the song White Rabbit performed by Jefferson Airplane. So like using that
Wow.
song to then market this like kind of re-release. And I read that it was like screenings were selling out at college campuses and stuff to watch this movie again. So again, I think that like they were at least in tune with like what was going on at the time. And
Yeah.
I like to think that there was some level of psychedelics or mind altering substances involved in the creation of this.
Yeah, so I mean, going back to the 50s, I mean, I'm sure mushrooms were still a thing, but like, I think LSD and stuff hadn't really come into play yet, right? Like that was more 60s when that got invented. I'm not 100% on my timeline. I don't know, maybe. I mean, at the very least, they leaned into it once it became that, right? Like they probably picked up on like a, hey, everybody likes this for this one reason. Let's lean into it in our marketing, which is just a smart way to do it. And you see companies do that these days when something kind of gets a groundswell of support for any particular reason. I want to fully admit I have never partaken in any psychedelics. I'm not necessarily against it. Not going to say that I never would. But I don't have that background to where I can say, this looks just like something that you might see. Because like I'm just going off of what I've heard from other people. I don't have any direct, experience with that.
But but I do think that they're like creatively, these people are maybe taking some leaps in terms of like what you can see. And again, LSD is a totally different drug, right? Like I haven't taken acid, but I I have heard stories of what it's like. But overall, like I want to hear what your experience was like viewing it this time. Like an
Yeah.
adult, sounds like you were, in a good state of mind. Like how did
Yeah,
it strike you?
I was at least open to this sort of thing.
Open-minded. Yeah, sure. So was it like, did it strike you as kiddish? It is fairly episodic, like the book is, right? Like there's these sequences that lead into sequences that kind of don't have a ton of connective tissue. It's more so just like this is happening and that's happening.
Yeah, I thought there were a few times where it lagged a little bit, like in its pacing, got a little bit caught up in some truly beside the point kind of storytelling. Now, a lot of it's beside the point, but some of it felt like really beside the point. And there were a few times where I found myself getting a little, antsy for it to move on. But that all comes down to just personal taste and where you're at in life. I had a good time with it overall. Again, it's very different than what I was expecting from a Disney film from this era, and I was sort of charmed by that in that difference.
Yeah.
So yeah, overall it was a fairly enjoyable watch for me. What about you?
I really liked it. I think in trying to compare this to other Disney movies, I did start to realize like why I sort of gravitated towards the story, in that it's very unique. I think that I would recommend, if people like, for what, hadn't seen this movie and hadn't seen another Disney movie of this era, I think this is one that I would point to as like a chance to see them like experiment and try something. It's a little more abstract, right? It's not as like cookie cutter sort of Disney as you get for a lot of these films. And for me, that really worked, because we're just in a time period where it's been, closing in on 100 years since Disney movies started, like 90 years of Disney movies. And it feels like anytime they do something that deviates in an interesting way, especially that early on, is interesting to look back on in like a historical context and just in like an artistic context of like who, and like thinking of, because of course we say this is Walt Disney's Alice in Wonderland, but there were 4 directors on this. There were tons of other like sequence directors. And from what I understand, a lot of these sequence directors were like looking over each other's shoulders and trying to kind of one up each other in these like contained sequences that they would then splice together as one film. And I think there's a bit of that going on that you can feel in the pacing. But at the same time, there's something cool about that. And
kind of
like,
it almost does feel like there's 4 different movies that happened over the course of this, so I totally get that.
Well, and there's much more sequence directors too. Like there's a lot of cooks in the kitchen. And I actually read in the Disney films, which I think is some sort of documentary or something, some retrospective, Leonard Maltin was in there, and he was talking about one of the animators, Ward Kimball, felt the film failed because it suffered from too many cooked directors. Here was a case of 5 directors, each working to top the other guy and make his sequence the biggest and craziest in the show. This had a self-canceling effect on the final product. Because we address that, this is also like critics of the time, and now I think people look back more fondly. It's interesting to analyze that as well and say like, all right, well, is that a failure, or is that somewhere where like this is almost like you can think of it in like segments.
It's just a series of adventures, and they all have a slightly different vibe to them. They're all trying to stand out as being the most important. It's kind of cool. It's one of those things where like, you look back at it 20 years later and you have a fondness for it, and you say, wow, that was a weird thing we made. And it was kind of cool in its own way, even if it doesn't conform with a lot of what people were expecting. I think that's it. Honestly, I feel like both are right. It's right to be a little bit like, this is probably why it didn't work as well. It wasn't a commercial success initially. And then also, recognize why it went on to have some success. Before we get into like more background stuff, we're going to go behind the scenes. We're going to have more research to talk about, and then we're going to go more chronologically through the actual plot. I just wanted to mention that we just released a Patreon exclusive episode on the Fallout TV show. James and I are both big fans of the series in general, like the video game series. And so we had watched the first season and we wanted to talk about it. And over on Patreon, that's the kind of place where we will do like video game reactions, stuff like that. That's a little outside of what we normally do on the main feed. But we would love to have you over there. And you can check out that and much more other bonus content on patreon.com/inkToFilm.
So getting more into how this kind of fits in Walt Disney's legacy and like what this story meant to him, I read that he was familiar with this series of books, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass, because he read them as a schoolboy. So we're talking this story travels with him for a long time. In 1923, while he was working at Laugh-O-Gram Studio in Kansas City, he produced a short film titled Alice's Wonderland, which was loosely inspired by the Alice books and featured a live-action girl interacting with an animated world. Faced with business problems, that studio went under, and that film was never released to the public. But when Disney left and went to Hollywood and started, trying to create feature films, he used that film, Alice's Wonderland, to show to potential distributors. So like Alice in Wonderland, pretty pivotal right from the get-go for Disney's legacy.
So we talked about that last week, and if you haven't listened to our episode on the books, definitely check that out, because we get all into Lewis Carroll and the sort of why he's a controversial figure. But one of the ones I forgot to mention was Walt Disney, of course, hugely influenced by Alice in Wonderland. And if you think about that, like how influential a figure Disney is, that just shows the legacy of this thing and how it has formed so much of like children's cinema and just storytelling in general.
So in 1933, there was a possible adaptation that Walt was working on that was going to be feature length, and it would be sort of live action and animated again. Disney was still a little hesitant, and actually Paramount Pictures got the film rights to do a live action version of their own. and he quickly scrapped it and kind of put it away. But in 1936, he produced a Mickey Mouse short film called Through the Mirror, which was based on Carroll's second Alice novel, Through the Looking Glass, featuring Mickey Mouse going through a mirror into a world where all the items in his house become alive.
It's there from the beginning, man. Wow.
Yeah, it really, really is. So after the enormous success of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in 1937, which he was kind of considering doing, he was like, should I do Alice? Should I do Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs? Ultimately, Paramount and some of the other things that went on stopped him from doing Alice, and he was like, I'll do Snow White. We saw what happened with Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs in our coverage. If you want to learn more about Disney, we talk about him there as well as an individual and sort of his beginnings. But success of that then led to him acquiring the rights to the Alice books and John Tenniel's illustrations from the Macmillan Company. Now, like those are like I think the most iconic art.
Those are the ones we talked about last week. Yeah.
Right. So those are the
ones
most.
He was the guy who actually worked with Lewis Carroll to develop those illustrations. Yeah.
Disney registered the title with the Motion Pictures Association of America, so he's getting very close to creating this. He hired a storyboard artist named Al Perkins to develop the story, and he came up with a 161-page analysis of the book and preliminary ideas, story treatment, and just a summary for a lot of these scenes. But then eventually David Hall came on to create concept artwork, and they got pretty far along to create something called a Leica reel, which is like rough sketches and so just an amalgamation of trying to show what this is going to be like with paintings and all kinds of different media, like different music used as well. Anyway, when Disney saw it, he wasn't happy with it. He was like, oh, it's not working. Something's not working here. The drawings too closely resembled Tenniel's illustrations, making them not only similar and not very much in the Disney style, but also they would be more difficult to animate, and the tone was more like grotesque and dark.
Yeah, I was gonna say those early images, while iconic, would not feel like Disney. That would be something different.
Right. So then eventually Walt felt like he could just sit on it. He's like, there's no harm in letting it sit for a little while. We'll come back to it. And along the way, Pinocchio and Fantasia are released in the early 1940s, along with the start of World War II, which, kind of cut into the international market for films. So Bank of America, Joseph Rosenberg of Bank of America issued an ultimatum to Disney and restricted him to only producing animated shorts and asked him to finish his features already in production. So no other feature film would begin work until they had been released and earned back their costs. Because of this, they shelved Alice in Wonderland again until around 1945, which is when Disney's friend and author Aldous Huxley was brought on to work on that live action and animated feature again. This eventually would go through a bunch of development, and then Disney would realize in order to do justice by the book, he wanted to do a completely animated feature, and animation for Alice in Wonderland and Cinderella were happening simultaneously, where they were kind of racing to see who was going to finish first in an interesting way. So not only do you have all these different directors and people working to, they're fulfilling their own creative visions in an umbrella of Walt Disney's, but then they're also racing with the animators over at Cinderella. So there's a lot of stuff going on as this film is releasing.
Yeah, it's always fascinating to hear like all the behind the scenes stuff and like why certain films came out when they did. Especially this one that seems like it was in the making for a long time before it ever came out. And that kind of leads to that too many cooks thing, right?
Yeah, and then ultimately the film comes out and it's not very critically successful. Cinderella probably was the more successful for the time period.
Oh, yeah.
And so this film is like forgotten about, and it's turned into an installment of a show that Disney created called The Magical World of Disney, where they cut it down to a 1 hour time slot, like I mentioned. Last week I talked about how like it became very cool to like Alice in Wonderland, I felt, for a period of time. And I think part of that was the affiliation with some of the drugs, but I'm talking like in the 90s and to early 2000s as well, where it was like Disney wanted to, it sounds like, avoid some of the more grotesque, but some of like the darker elements of Alice in Wonderland spoke to a lot of kids, I think, and stuck with them. And me especially, like I just remember feeling like it had a tone, like there were dark parts of a lot of different Disney movies, but typically they were more so a section, and then they would overcome whatever darkness that was and move on. But this film has such a weird vibe to it in general.
Yeah,
like it's like overbearingly like weird, kind of creepy. People are rude and just like bizarre. Everyone's mad. There's something very unique about that in a way that like that I found was cool. And I wanted to mention too, here in town, obviously I live in Orlando, so there's quite a bit of Disney people and Disney related things. There's a really cool experience you can do in town. It's like a tea house and it's called High Tea. And you have to dress up for it, and it's like this very formal event, but they have like performers that are completely dressed in like, the Red Queen comes around and kind of berates you, and they'll have like a white rabbit run by. Like they have all of this stuff
Uh-huh.
set up, and you're sitting in this really psychedelic room with like mushrooms that are larger than you, and there's like a hookah smoking caterpillar in the
Yeah,
corner. And
yeah.
so it's like very well themed. And stuff like that is when I'm like, this has transcended the story at that point. Like it's almost its own like sort of subgenre or something.
Yeah.
Like it's
It
this.
tapped into the zeitgeist in a way, and it became like each of those kind of figures became synonymous with a certain element. They became like archetypes. They became
Yeah.
larger than the story itself. I agree with that, and that goes all the way back to the original story by Lewis Carroll and how this thing has just morphed over time and really grown beyond, its more humble beginnings, I guess.
I think a lot about like the devious Cheshire Cat and like
Yeah.
how all-knowing he is in some ways, and like I just love that character. And yeah,
The
so
Mad Hatter, the Mad Hatter is such an interesting figure because I feel like he represents, again, like speaking more like broadly and archetypal, like a figure that like shows up, is kind of charismatic and interesting, but it's unclear if they're helpful or not. It's unclear whether or not they're friend or foe or something else. They're so sort of inscrutable with their madness. There's something always compelling about a character like that. And then, of course, you give them like iconic costuming, and it's going to be something that's going to be referenced time and again, and has been, I think.
yeah. I just with the Cheshire Cat, like the smile too. I read in my research something I never realized before, but it is somewhat of a reference, and I think it's got to be true. I read that Pokemon Gengar, the smile and the grin of like the
Oh,
ghost and disappearing Gengar is possibly like a reference to the Cheshire Cat, and I'm like, that's so true, and that's
yes.
so fitting for that Pokemon and that character, like very much in that same archetype, like you're talking about.
Yeah, talk about another character where it's like the motivations are so unclear.
Yeah.
Is the Cheshire Cat helpful? I don't know, or is it just like trolling, or just having like amusing itself? It's so unclear.
And like the darkness of Alice in Wonderland 2 is kind of what happens on the peripherals. This movie, like
Yeah.
when one of my favorite shots is when Alice is leaving the tea party and she looks back and like the tea party is going to assumingly continue on forever.
Hmm.
Any days that's not their birthday because it's the
Yeah.
unbirthday celebration.
So yeah, 1 or 2 days a year.
Every day they're just like in a fucking manic state,
Yeah.
364 days a year at this tea party, kind of trapped there in their own minds in ways. And she's like, I'm so glad to get out of there. And you're like, these characters are clearly going through mental torture.
I don't know. They seem to be having a good time.
They think they
The
are.
March Hare, seems very excitable, and then you got this like snoozy dormouse that
Mhm.
shows up every now and then just to deliver a couple of banger lines. So, yeah, very very interesting sequence. There's a lot like that where it's just like one thing to the next. It was kind of my same issue with the book, right? Where I was like, I don't know. It was very like there's very little connecting tissue to this, and if anything, the movie did give it a little more, but it still maintained that like we're just on to the next thing now. We're kind of following the White Rabbit throughout the movie, but like often we forget about that. And then like even that doesn't even really resolve in a way that feels satisfying. And that's kind of the point, is that it is just very dreamlike and surreal, and things don't always have to resolve in that way.
Yeah, I love that. Like we talk about transitioning from one scene to another, or a character having like some agency in a story and like affecting the plot. And like so much of this, like Alice is very clearly affecting the plot, but so much of it goes into this weird, like for example, like when she is in the room and the first time she's getting larger and smaller, trying to get through the door, and then she ends up in the bottle and then floats through the door and then it's just on the ocean and
Yeah.
like this, it's so
So strange.
batshit.
And she cries to create that water. At
Yeah,
first, she's like crying and she's big, so like the tears are all collecting. All of a sudden, it's like a lake has formed from her tears, and then yeah, she shrinks down into a bottle and she's like on that lake. But then it definitely like transitions to be in like the ocean,
yeah.
and that's just so dreamlike because there's no like rhyme or reason to that. It just becomes that now. And then her whole thing about she's trying to get the key to get through the door, but then like I think we just leave that behind, and now she's on the ocean. And
I
like,
thought for sure that she needed to get the key, like in my memory of that scene.
yeah, well, she
but
feels like she does, but I
yeah,
don't think it ever leads anywhere.
it doesn't. Yeah.
Yeah.
But we're talking a lot of plot here. I'm just going to read through these sections. So a young girl named Alice listens distractedly to her sister's history lesson and begins daydreaming of a nonsensical world. She spots a passing white rabbit in a waistcoat who panics of being late. Alice follows him into a burrow and plummets down a deep rabbit hole. Upon landing in a place called Wonderland, she finds herself facing a tiny door whose handle advises drinking from a bottle on a nearby table. She shrinks to an appropriate height, but has forgotten the key on the table. She then eats a cookie that causes her to grow excessively. Exasperated by these changes of state, she begins to cry and floods the room with her tears. She takes another sip from the bottle to shrink again and rides the empty bottle through the keyhole. As Alice continues to follow the rabbit after encountering a caucus race, she encounters numerous characters including Tweedledum and Tweedledee, who recount the tales of the walrus and the carpenter. Alice tracks the rabbit to his house. He mistakes her for his handmaid, Mary Ann, and sends her inside to retrieve his gloves. Alice finds and eats another cookie and grows giant, getting stuck in the house. Thinking her a monster, the rabbit asks the dodo to help expel her. When the dodo decides to burn the house down, Alice escapes by eating a carrot from the rabbit's garden, which causes her to shrink to 3 inches tall.
Wow. Okay. So that, according to that, she sails through the keyhole. That may be true. I mean, I didn't remember it actually passing through the keyhole, but okay. So she kind of didn't need the key, I guess, at that point, if she's just sailing right through it.
That's
regardless.
True. Yeah.
I didn't realize that was supposed to be her sister. I kind of interpreted that as mother for some reason.
So did I. She seemed
a lot
much older.
And more like adult likes, right? Like it would be weird for her. She's young enough to where she shouldn't have like an adult sister. It didn't seem like to me. I mean, not like you couldn't, but that just seems unusual. Yeah, interesting opening. She talks about wanting to have a world where books only have pictures. And she's singing to her kitty, which is very reminiscent of Through the Looking Glass as far as the book goes.
Mm-hmm.
Yet the other elements of this are more similar to Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, following the White Rabbit, going down the rabbit hole. White Rabbit, super red eyes, which I always thought was an interesting detail that seemed to evoke something to do with drugs, maybe.
Sometimes there'll be albino rabbits too, right? Like a white rabbit with red eyes.
Yeah, I guess that's true. It didn't look like that was what they were going for to me, but maybe that was. Regardless, she follows him in, and she tumbles down this rabbit hole, and I love this sequence. It gets really trippy. There's a kind of a fun element going on with her dress is acting like a parachute. It keeps like billowing up and like making her go slow, but then she'll turn, and then she'll fall faster, and then there's like this whole physical element as she's tumbling. She's talking about falling through the center of the earth. And then as she's going, things are getting really trippy and strange. Like we see just psychedelic looking backgrounds. She like lifts on a rocking chair at one point and then slips off of it again. And I think this is just like the first introduction to like what this movie is going to be like. And I thought it was well done. It was cool. And I love that that element of like there being some cleverness, some logic to it, some like math and numerical games being played. Like a lot of that is still present and carries over from the book.
Something that I was thinking about in this viewing is the mannerisms of characters and like the kind of believability or like the genuine nature of like what it's like to see someone in a scene. Their facial reactions, expressions are very important in film, reactions in general to what's going on. And I was reading a lot about like how the animators went about doing that. And as with a lot of Disney films, they had actual actors on set. And in some cases, they were the actors who were the voices of these characters. So Catherine Beaumont was the little girl who played Alice, and she was actually there on set acting in the stage where the animators would watch and kind of draw right there as she was going through the scenes and like dealing with different characters and different reactions. And many of these
interesting, like that's like before the era where we have all of this technology to capture these mocap, literally the faces. It was like them recognizing that was the best way to do it, is you want to capture what the face actually looks like on the performer. They just didn't have the way to do it we do today.
And Disney was always great about like finding, and like there was the whole animation school basically of like find what exaggerated part of a character could you play up to then create some sort of archetype or create some sort of shorthand for like who this character was.
Yeah.
And I think that like those well-trained artists were picking up on a lot of this from the performance. I would say that's probably part of the success of the Disney films as they went on, is like just like how meticulous they were. The artistry is like very clear, but like always understanding like the characters are real people, like not treating them like some animated cartoon that kids are going to watch, but rather like something to be looked at as if we were watching a live action film.
And Alice always felt that way. She felt a lot more like, even as she changes shape and size with these things she's eating and drinking, she just always had the feel of like a human, right? Like she didn't feel like when you meet the Hatter, like human-like, but like so sort of cartoonish. And she never really felt that way to me. Yeah, I think that comes across, and that is probably a big selling point for people. You can kind of see yourself more in the character for that reason. Yeah, and then I thought this was so fascinating how there's that sight gag where you open the door and there's another door behind it, and there's another door behind it, and each one keeps getting progressively smaller. And I feel like I've seen this in like a bunch of movies, and I'm like realizing that every time that's happened now, it's been a reference to this moment, right? And it's so fascinating how it's like backfilling a lot of stuff where I'm like, oh, this is a reference, and I've seen it. It
does feel
times.
A bit like Tom and Jerry or like Wile E. Coyote and Roadrunner type thing too, right? Where it's like zany and like it's just like you couldn't have seen it coming. It is like a sight gag. And
doesn't something like that happen in Wonka when they're like getting into the factory for the first time? There's like a series of doors or something. I thought there was something very much like that.
I could definitely see it. I don't remember that exactly, but yeah.
Yeah, it's maybe not the exact same thing, but it's something kind of similar.
Yeah.
Also, I was kind of pleased to see Mr. Dodo here as a sort of, we talked about, like that was kind of a reference in the book to Lewis Carroll, who struggled to say his real last name, which started with a D. So it was kind of just a little like nod to the author, and I like that it made it in here.
One more thing that I found with sort of the performers being involved, they actually, when Alice is trapped in this house in a second, when she grows larger in the house, they actually the animators were like, well, we need to be able to see like what she's doing inside of the house. So
that looked cool.
The carpenters actually created basically like plexiglass or like see-through framework house that they could then see inside of and see like how. I
was wondering how that effect was done, because there was definitely something going on. It was like on different plates or something. I was like, we're getting a sense of like this distance between foreground and background.
And that's actually a good refresher that we should say to our audience and people who didn't listen to our Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs coverage, is like there's like background materials and there's these animation cells, and the way that they're shooting this is like these multi-tiered cells basically are and they're able to like manipulate them and create like sense of depth, really a great sense of depth in these 2D animation cells. But when they pull them apart and manipulate them and move them around in front of the camera and take a picture of them, it like once you add all that together, it gives really good motion and depth.
And Disney was sort of famous for pioneering this technology and this look.
So a lot of the time it's like same background, and they'll put a cell down, it'll be a character, they'll take a picture of it, move the cell, do another picture, and depending on how complicated the shot is, like there's the famous shot in Snow White that we talked about where the camera is like traveling through and past a bunch of trees. So it's really three-dimensional in the way that it's like dollying in past trees, and layers are coming out as they get closer.
We also kind of hopped over in that synopsis, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, who she meets in the woods, and they tell her this story. And this is a moment where I was like, what is this movie doing? Because they show up and they're like, we're going to tell you a story, and they're goofballs, and they're kind of behaving in a just silly way. And then they tell the story of like Mr. Walrus and this like sailor friend, I forget what his name is.
He's a carpenter.
The carpenter. Yeah. And they're like out looking for oysters, and we meet all these oysters who are like made to look like little babies. And then there's like Mama Oyster, and then they're like basically big bad wolfing, pretending to be their friends, and then like inviting them to come to dinner. And then the walrus gets in there and like, I don't know, he's like, he's trying to be all charming. The carpenter like whips up a fake restaurant in like in a rush so that they can come in and think that they're at just like a restaurant to eat dinner with the walrus. But then the whole turn of the story is that the walrus like eats all of the oysters while the carpenter is in the other room. And it's really dark because we've anthropomorphized all of these oysters to be like little babies who are helpless. And this big walrus dude just eats them all. And when the guy comes back out, they're like all dead and shelled. And he's just mad that he didn't get to share in this feast. And then the only thing we get from that is like Alice says something because she's like, he's like, oh, there's a lesson to this story, and she's like, I guess if you're an oyster, because she kind of recognizes that it's kind of dark, but like other than that kind of lamp shading of it, this is just a weird dark story that happens right in the middle of this movie and doesn't seem to have any purpose, and then we move on from it and it never comes back up. And I don't know, that was the kind of thing where I was like, this is such a strange movie.
It really was. I didn't expect, my memory of this wasn't that they were going to die, and it was very
Yeah.
dark, and I was like, what is this? It feels almost like so Disney was well known for like short films, like short animated films, right? And then
Yeah.
you get something like Fantasia in 1940 where it's like all of these different stories that are sliced together to create like this ongoing like musical narrative. There's nothing to really connect them, but their individual stories are so fascinating and like visually interesting. And this reminded me, it's very reminiscent of that. It's so much a deviation from the Alice in Wonderland story. Like we're going into this walrus in the Carpenter story, and like you said, super dark. Did not think they were going to kill these these oysters. I also saw in my research that like there's I guess the common knowledge before refrigeration existed was you weren't supposed to eat oysters in any month that had an R in it. And
Okay.
there was a moment when the mother oyster is like, "Stay with me" or whatever, and looks at the
She looks
calendar,
at a
and
calendar. Yeah,
a
yeah.
big R like in red like pops up, and it's kind of a
Okay.
visual like joke about not eating oysters, and it was in a
So
month that
that's
had
why she
R in
thinks
it.
that they're safe.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's exactly they're safe or they're not safe, but either way, like that's the visual joke is there for like that's the common knowledge is like don't eat oysters with a month that has an R in it.
And so we get a repeated gag that, like, I think really leans into this drug culture and why people like it is that she just keeps encountering things that say, like, eat me on them, and she just does it. She's like, all right, I'm going to eat this cookie. I'm going to drink this
Yeah,
potion that says drink me. At one point, she's like, oh, this could be poison, and I probably shouldn't drink it, but I'm going to do it anyway. And it might catch up to me, but oh
yeah,
well.
that was one of my favorite jokes. Is like something about like she's like I'm giving myself advice,
Yeah.
and the advice was like if you have a certain number of drops of poison, basically at some point it's going to catch up to you. But like that, it's so funny
Yeah, but then
because it's
she's like,
like
but I'm very bad at taking my own advice. And then she
yeah,
just drinks it.
and then she takes it anyway. Yeah, it's also like perception changing, right? Like whether it's like
Yeah.
like affecting her mental state
Well, she's
is
getting
debatable.
higher if you think of it, higher and lower.
There's that, yeah,
And she grows to fill this house, and like I don't know, that whole sequence is just kind of goofy, right? Like the way she kind of is sticking out of it's on her head. They're gonna burn it at one point. A lot of like kind of slapstick, like big reactions from the rabbit, who's like finding like when he realizes that the walrus is proposing that they burn the house. Yeah, it's like amusing, but I'm like, what are we doing here? Like, what does this all have to do with anything? And then like you kind of have to let go of that. Just like this is the movie. We're just gonna get these little weird moments. They're loosely connected to one another,
yeah.
and that's what the sort of charm is of this movie.
Well, it would be one thing too if like she set out on the adventure and it was like go find the Red Queen or something like that, and there was a goal in mind, but there's never a goal. She's just
This
kind
is
of like
following the
stumbling
rabbit,
through everything,
kind
yeah,
of.
down the rabbit hole, and where that'll take you, I guess, right? That's why that expression exists.
We get a whole sequence where she's singing with these flowers. They sing about the golden afternoon, and that was one that I felt like just kind of went on a long time and was kind of strange. Didn't really feel like it had much to do with anything. And then, sure enough, she's just like, "All right, and I'm done," and she like leaves.
Yeah,
Like it
they
doesn't
call her a
really go
weed
anywhere.
and they kind of kick her out and stuff. Yeah,
Yeah, which often like that's kind of the thing. It's like she finds a reason to kind of bump up against the thing that she's interacting with, and then she'll just walk away. And yeah, she gets a little bit of like a trying to get home vibe, but that doesn't really happen until later in the movie. Like early on, it doesn't even seem like she's interested in getting home.
no, yeah, she's exploring.
Yeah.
I guess also to go back to the drug stuff, they say the word weed in the movie, so that's like
Oh,
a
there you
clear
go.
sign, you know.
There you go.
So continuing the story, Alice continues to follow the rabbit, meets a garden of talking flowers, who initially welcome her with a song, but then banish her, believing that humans are a type of weed. Alice then encounters a caterpillar smoking, who becomes enraged at Alice after she laments her small size, which is the same as the caterpillar's, after which the caterpillar turns into a butterfly and flies away. Before leaving, the caterpillar advises Alice to eat a piece from different sides of a mushroom to alter her size. Following a period of trial and error, she returns to her original height and keeps the remaining pieces in her pocket. In the woods, Alice gets stuck between multiple paths and encounters the mischievous Cheshire Cat, who suggests questioning the Mad Hatter or the March Hare to learn the rabbit's location, but is unhelpful in giving directions. Taking her own path, Alice encounters both, along with the Dormouse in the midst of an unbirthday tea party celebration. The Hatter and the Hare ask Alice to explain her predicament, to which Alice tries but becomes frustrated by their interruptions and absurd logic. As she prepares to leave, the rabbit appears and the Hatter attempts to repair his pocket watch, which results in its destruction. Alice attempts to follow the rabbit after he is ejected from the premises, but decides to go home instead. Unfortunately, her surroundings completely change, leaving her lost in the forest, and she begins to cry along with many forest creatures, which vanish.
Yeah. And that just sounds as wild as it is. Going all the way back to the caterpillar, this is the like strongest druggy vibes you get. You got a character who's smoking, all these different colored,
but it's strange. I didn't
kinds
remember
of smoke, and like that. It was in the book, and it was hookah in the book, and it is hookah here ostensibly,
which is usually tobacco. And he also doesn't act in the way that you would expect somebody on drugs to act.
Right.
Like he's like getting pissed off and like getting in her face and freaking out, and like that's not really what happens. So interesting. Like there is the smoking. Obviously, there's the smoking thing going on, and yeah, I guess if it's like PCP or something, like who knows? But
eat somebody's face.
I don't think you're usually smoking PCP through a hookah.
That's probably fair.
So
it was fun.
Yeah.
Like I like that character, and like having the letters appearing as he was talking, and like every time he would say something, like some little image would show up.
Usually vowels.
That was a cool effect, turning into a butterfly and flying away. You could kind of see that as a metamorphosis through psychedelics or something. Like you can read into that.
Yeah. I mean, just having smoke around too is like hookah's not the only thing that you can smoke.
And then she leaves that scene by eating mushrooms, like literally, and like trial and error. And then she eventually learns that she has to like lick a mushroom to get to the right amount of high to be able to get out of there. Yeah, it's definitely says a lot. And then we meet the Cheshire Cat, who I thought, this portrayal of the cat is iconic, right? Like the whole like the head is sort of detached from the body. Kind of rolling around, kicking it around.
Well, it's like incorporeal,
so
right?
Yeah, it's like totally like magical creature. Absolutely.
Constantly like can become corporeal, and then its tail will go away. It's very interesting.
Yeah, really cool character. And again, one of those characters where it's like, is this thing helpful or not? Like I can't tell what it's actually doing here. But it's fun, and it's so funny that there's like I didn't realize this in the book, but it's totally true. It's like, oh, you can either go to the March Hare or you can go to the Mad Hatter. Doesn't tell her which way she should go. She ends up just choosing a path, and then she meets them both anyway. It's like, again, they're there together, so whatever, That's just like the nature of the dream, I guess, that we're on here.
And then we get to this unbirthday party, and it's as insane as possible. Like it is so just wild, like man. I honestly watching the movie overstimulated. I was like when that scene, I was getting stressed out.
There's so much happening in like every frame.
Yeah, and they're just like so anxiety inducing. Like they're like, come on.
They look like they've had a lot of caffeine at the very least, if not something stronger.
Some of the white powdery substance, possibly.
Yeah. They're like singing these little songs. They're asking her questions, which I think a lot of that comes right out of the book. Where she ends up mentioning a cat, which freaks out the dormouse. There's like certain things like that. But it's so manic, like you said earlier, and wild, and it's fun, but yeah, it is a bit much, and again, it just kind of unceremoniously ends. I guess the whole thing happens with the rabbit, which is not in the book. I don't remember, where they like take the stopwatch and like smash it open, and they're like filling it with like jams and like cake and stuff, and then
kind
of
like funny, honestly.
It kind of turns into like a living thing for a minute before it dies, and like it's very strange.
Yeah, I kind of liked it that time. Like I was like, okay, this is objectively funny. Like this is kind of interesting. I did see a few things that we should talk about here. Mad Hatter is apparently based on the phrase "mad as a hatter," which has a historical basis. In the hat industry in the 19th century, there was extensive use of mercury. Liquid mercury is one of the causes of mercury poisoning, which, among other things, causes brain damage. Among the symptoms are slurred speech, memory loss, and tremors, behavior that can be seen as insane.
I think I'd heard that somewhere else and I'd just forgotten. But as soon as you said that little factoid, I'm like, oh, that's something I've heard before. So
Yeah.
that totally tracks.
I always just assumed it was a character thing that he made up and Mad Hatter, but no, it's
Yeah.
apparently there's some basis in Hatters
Well, and we talked about
becoming.
that with Lewis Carroll, right? Like a lot of this stuff was actually referencing some real thing, and it's just like it's become more famous than the thing it was referencing now. So now we think it is the start of it.
Same thing with a Cheshire Cat. I read that like the grin of a Cheshire Cat was something that could be tracked all the way back to like the 1700s or something. So
Interesting.
he didn't actually create that. He just popularized it, it seems.
Yeah. Wow.
Something that people still debate to this day, and it's a riddle that Lewis Carroll wrote that shows up in this film.
Hmm.
Um,
What's the difference between a raven and a writing desk?
why is a raven like a writing desk?
Why
Yeah,
is a raven like a writing desk? Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So there is no answer. Lewis Carroll said there's no answer. It's nonsense. People should stop looking into it.
Uh-huh.
He, was adamant that there was no answer.
I just keep
And
thinking of Edgar Allan Poe when I hear that, but
that's what a lot of people end up at. So some of the suggestions that people say are the answer is because Edgar Allan Poe wrote on both.
hmm
So he wrote on Raven.
Sure,
Wrote on
sure, yeah.
Desk.
And he would have been around at the time of Lewis Carroll, right? Like he would have been, I think, contemporaries, if I'm getting my years correct.
It's close. Yeah, I'm not sure the exact years on that, but I
Yeah.
think that's definitely close. And then another one suggested was because the notes for which they are noted are not noted for being musical notes. The second of which is very similar to a solution that Carroll himself warily suggested when he grew tired of people asking him about it.
That's funny. It's like, fine, if you want that to be the answer, that'll be it.
Yep,
But
pretty
the whole
much.
point to me, it does seem like there's not supposed to be an answer. And that just, man, that just really kind of sums up the vibe of this movie and this whole story.
And my favorite part about that sequence when it's brought up is they then spin it on Alice. Like they ask
Yeah.
her and then she asks it back as like a rhetorical like what? What are you talking about? And they start freaking out. And they're like
Yeah.
they're like
How
completely
dare you ask that?
freaked
Yeah.
out by that question. Which again, it's absurd. It's like way overstimulating for me, especially,
Yeah.
but it does make for some kind of memorable and iconic moments.
Yeah. And then she goes into the Tolji Wood, which, so there's a lot of like references to the Jabberwocky, even though we don't get like the poem in its entirety. We have characters like singing portions of it, I think, at different points. Cheshire Cat, I think, says parts of it.
Yeah.
At the Tolji Wood. And the Tolji Wood is fucking weird as hell. Like all these animals and like, it's like a duck that looks like an object and the other like object creatures.
There's like a
Um,
like a deer with a shovel on its face and like
Yeah,
a
there's
bird.
glasses like bird, like
Yeah.
bird glasses. And they just like show up and they're all watching her and anthropomorphized, and then they just all start disappearing.
Yeah. I think
Not
that was the only
explained.
hint that we really get of not hint because I think the ending is very clear with that too, but I think it's like a hint early on for people to say like, oh yeah, she keeps saying like I just want to go away, I just want to go away. She's crying and kind of
At
looking
this
down.
point, her trip has gone a bit bad, and she's ready for it to be over.
And since she's in control of the trip apparently, everything
Yeah.
sort of starts to respond in turn.
Yeah, yeah.
So you did mention the Jabberwocky, and there were a few things that were cut from the book that they considered putting in the film, and some things were cut for time. But the Jabberwock was originally going to be used, and they had to decide what the monster was going to look like. They ended up with a comical-looking dragon-like beast with bells and factory whistles on its head. Yeah, so the scene never appeared and was
Okay,
scrapped.
interesting. I like the Jabberwocky and the Jabberwock or whatever it is, like being almost more of a thought form, and that it shouldn't have like a, and like if Disney had put out a version of it, like that would be what it looks like now.
Like the Cheshire Cat and the Mad Hatter, like it would have defined it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like it being ill-defined. I guess I prefer it that way.
Yeah, I'm kind of with you there. I definitely, I would be curious to see what a character design would look like for it. But
Yeah,
yeah, I'm
and
glad
there
that
has
it
been.
didn't
Like if you
also.
Google it, you'll find a bunch of different depictions of it. People have
Yeah.
taken stabs at it.
Something else, we were talking a bit about Carroll, and I wanted to talk about there's an effort to retain his poems and a lot of the poems, and Disney commissioned a lot of the top songwriters of the day to compose songs for this movie. Over 30 potential songs were written. Many of them were included in the film, some only for a few seconds.
Yeah.
And this is the greatest number of songs and the greatest number of characters that appear in a Disney film.
That tracks, just because of the nature of this movie we've talked about. And there was a lot of songs. I was kind of taken aback at just how musical this was. It's a Disney film from this era. It was going to be musical, but there was a lot of the singing. And unfortunately to me, there wasn't a lot of like standouts. There was a lot of just like, okay. And even with all these top songwriters, I don't know, nothing really stuck with me as a song that I thought was, really catchy. Or
There was like one or two that I thought were more memorable than the others, but yeah, nothing was like a breakout smash hit like a lot of the Disney films of this era were. So continuing on with the story here, the Cheshire Cat reappears to the despondent Alice and offers a path to the hot-headed Queen of Hearts, the only one in Wonderland who can take her home. In the Queen's Labyrinth garden, Alice witnesses the Queen, whom the rabbit serves as a chamberlain, sentencing a trio of playing cards to beheading for painting mistakenly planted white rose bushes red. The Queen invites a reluctant Alice to play against her in a croquet match in which live flamingos, card guards, and hedgehogs are used as equipment. The equipment rig the game in favor of the Queen. The cat appears again and plays a trick on the Queen, setting up Alice to be framed. Before the Queen can sentence her to execution, the King suggests a formal trial. At Alice's trial, the cat invokes more chaos by having Alice point him out, causing one of the witnesses, the Dormouse, to panic. As the Queen sentences Alice to execution, Alice eats the mushroom pieces to grow large, momentarily intimidating the court. However, the mushroom's effect is short-lived, forcing Alice to flee through the deteriorating realm with a large crowd in pursuit. When Alice reaches the small door she encountered, she sees herself sleeping through the keyhole. Alice emerges from her dream and returns home for tea with her sister.
So I want to ask you, this whole sequence with the Queen, playing croquet, getting sentenced, going to trial, where does this stack for you among the other like mini movies that we get throughout all these little different adventures? Where does this one line up?
I have to say that this one stood out in my memory. Like it wasn't the Walrus and the Carpenter for me. Like it was something that I did remember, and I think it is so because it's so tied to that motif, like the card game motif, and just the games in general. I found it really interesting. She was referring to them by their numbers on the card, and it seemed like the hearts cards maybe had like some hierarchy of like status over some of the other ones because she's the Queen of Hearts. And then it opens up the idea of like, are there other queens and kings of different other suits? And yeah, just she's like a powerful figure in the story with beheading people in a Disney film. So, or at least
Yeah.
like saying that they should.
I don't think we see anyone beheaded.
I would say it ranks pretty highly, maybe like a top 3. It's like the unbirthday party is up there.
Yeah.
The initial keyhole getting bigger and smaller is up there.
Yeah.
The stuff with the Cheshire Cat, and I would put this right in there.
Caterpillar.
Yeah, caterpillar scene.
I think it's up there, but I think it to me comes in under a lot of those other scenes. I like the scene a lot in the book. It was like one of the most memorable and like engaging moments. I found this version like a little underwhelming for whatever reason. We had just come off the high of the unbirthday party and the whole tea party, which was like a really interesting moment. The Queen was compelling. She's very over the top, and has a bit of that like grotesque, like early Disney vibe of like she's a unattractive woman, therefore she must be evil. But it goes okay. I think part of it is also like there's a lot of these like songs where we get a lot of cards flying around the screen, like shuffling and unshuffling. I found that a little bit less interesting.
The chases were interesting in the maze and stuff, and as they chase her through the tunnel,
Yeah,
how it got
that's at the very end. Yeah. So, but before that, like all the stuff like with the croquet, maybe it's because I had read it already, but like I don't know. The flamingo stuff was kind of cool. The way they were cheating for her, but somewhere in there,
Maybe the
somewhere
trial was less
between that and the trial, I found myself losing interest in a way that I hadn't yet in the movie. Maybe it's because it was also towards the end and I've been watching it for a while. But I just found myself like I don't know. I'm like ready for this to be over.
You needed to take another hit, is what it sounded like.
Maybe have another mint. Yeah, I don't know. I think that it is okay. I would have liked for this to be the crowning moment of the movie, and instead it falls somewhere shy of a lot of the moments that happened earlier.
Yeah.
So it was kind of an underwhelming end to me. But that's okay. It was still pretty fun. And then yeah, like the whole sequence of her leaving was trippy and weird. And coming back to the real world, as it should be.
To agree with what you're saying, though, I did feel like the conflict and everything kind of fizzles nearing the end.
Yeah.
Like it doesn't go out with a bang; it kind of fizzles away. But
Which is how
maybe
the book
that's
ends,
part of the nature of a dream, like weird, like non-ending kind of thing that tends to happen in dreams.
It's true, and part of this is again probably just me like wanting this to form into a more I don't know, recognizable structure, and maybe that's a failing of mine as a storyteller. Like I should be more embracing of this like, really unusual type of story. I guess I just wanted it to feel like one of the most iconic sequences, and it to me it falls very much more in the middle of the road.
Yeah,
Um,
I did like that we got the Cheshire Cat again, and he was kind of fucking around, which just probably my favorite character in the whole movie.
and throughout, Alice, she has that rebellious nature. This feels a lot like Alice in the book. She's very curious. She's not taking shit from anybody. She's standing up for herself. And again, just kind of like living life to its fullest, where she's just eating and drinking things and engaging with things. And I can see why a lot of people like her. Well, this costume became iconic. I'm sure you see, Alice every year in Halloween costumes. Just an iconic character and an iconic figure. And I think a lot of that is owed to this Disney version, even as we give plenty of credit to the author. So if you're ready, man, I think it's time for us to decide which one we liked better, which one we ultimately want to award as the best version of this. Do you want to start off?
So I have to give credit to this visual style as being something that like really speaks to me, and I definitely want to talk about background artist Mary Blair, who was the kind of the person who submitted these concept drawings to move away from the Tenniel illustrations, taking a modernist stance using bold and unreal colors. Walt liked these designs, and the script was rewritten to focus on comedy, music, and whimsical side of Carroll's books. So I just definitely want to talk about Mary Blair and just like highlight her, because what I love about this movie is some of the visual style here and the way that it kind of is distinctly its own thing. And I do love that, like in an adaptation of such a weird story, the legacy of this story is not that it was played it safe and it's some run of the mill Disney story. It's that it's weird as hell and it's not necessarily for everyone, but it's still pretty universally loved in today's day and age. Like so much iconography in this film that's like become synonymous with like this weird sort of nonsense storytelling that sounds like Carroll pretty much invented for the most part, or at least popularized. So credit to him for that. But ultimately, I love the way that the Disney film kind of came together. It's very watchable to me. It has like the hallmark of a Disney film of the time with like the musical setting, the animation style, and then it just goes crazy and it seems dangerous. It seems dark in ways that not a lot of Disney films for the time were. So for those reasons, it's striking, and I'm going to take the film.
Okay. So to me, I had, things I loved about both, things I was critical about both. Both had similar issues that I think are inherent to the story. I do agree that this had a lot of more, with that thing you described, like more whimsy, more comedy, more songs. I think and both have like plenty of weirdness. And I don't know that I particularly love either of these. I don't think either of these are going to enter my like favorites of any genre. But I think ultimately I'm really having a hard time breaking the tie. So in that kind of situation, I'm going to go with my default, which is to give credit to the author. So I'm going to go back to the books and say that in the case of a tiebreaker goes to the creator, goes to the person who started this whole thing, kicked this whole thing off. So I'll give it to the books here, but this was very good. I had a lot of fun with it.
Yeah, and I don't blame you for that. I know people who are like massive Carroll fans weren't necessarily huge on this movie initially when it released, and maybe still aren't. But I do think that this does such a good job of kind of like introducing people to this style of storytelling. It felt like what Carroll was creating was more novel and more new for that time period, whereas Disney was, of course, like adapting this work, and in some way it may have informed all the other Disney movies before this, like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs and Fantasia and all that. But at the same time, like it does feel like a Disney film, and Carol's story just feels like unlike anything during that time period, I would assume.
Yeah. So that's going to be the end of our coverage of this. If you want to find out what we are going to cover next, stick around to the very end of the episode. We're going to announce a couple of options that are going to be put up to a vote, and we'll tell you how to vote on that. But if you enjoyed this episode, please let us know in the form of a rating and review on whatever app you chose to listen on. And if you're on YouTube, thank you for watching. Make sure to like the video and leave a comment and let us know your thoughts on Alice in Wonderland, what you prefer, which one's better, book or movie.
And be sure to connect with us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, all of those at Ink2Film. We're also on Blue Sky, TikTok.
And we would like to thank Lexan Music for their use of our intro and outro music. It is Alice in the Dark Wonderland.
All right, so if you're curious for what we're covering next, we are actually going to put this up to a poll. We couldn't decide. We are between two projects right now. One is the second Twilight novel and film, which is, I think, New Moon.
New Moon, Twilight New Moon. I haven't ever seen it, never read it. I just had my first experience with Twilight ever on the show. It seemed like that coverage was popular. People found those episodes entertaining, so we thought we could go back to it. We'd go back to that world. And I've again never seen, never read, so it would be my first time through.
And the other is a Christopher Nolan film called The Prestige, which has definitely been on our radar pretty much since we started the podcast.
Yeah, for a long time. Love that movie. Never read the book, so I'd be excited to get into that. It'd be a very different kind of episode. So like you could see that our poll is going to be between very different kinds of coverage. So we're just honestly curious. I'd be excited to talk about either one, honestly. And I'm just curious to see what people want. We are going to have a week off between now and the start of that project. It's just, we need to take a break for a moment here, a little spring break. You could think of it that way. We'll be releasing an episode from the vault. So there'll be something in your feed to check out. But I will be posting that poll onto our Patreon. You do not have to be a patron to vote on it, but I do think you have to at least follow us. So you can just follow for $0 if you want to be able to vote on that poll in particular. But we would love to have your support if you were feeling generous.
Yeah, honestly, I'd be happy with either of those. Twilight's going to be a lot of fun. Love talking about Christopher Nolan with his kind of heady type of filmmaking. And we'll be back with that after our week off. But until next time,
keep adapting.